The moment Clara Whitfield heard the sound, she reined her mare to a dead stop in the middle of the endless Kansas prairie, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird against a cage. It was the summer of 1878, and the grasslands of Hayes County stretched out in every direction like a great golden ocean, rippling under a wind that smelled of dry earth and distant rain. Clara had been riding back from town, her saddlebags heavy with flour and coffee, and a spool of blue thread she had promised herself for weeks. The afternoon sun hung low and fierce, painting everything amber and copper, and the shadows of the tall grass reached long fingers across the trail. She had been thinking about nothing in particular, humming a hymn her mother used to sing, letting the mare find her own pace home. And then she heard it. A sound so small and so miserable that it barely reached above the rustle of the wind, but it was unmistakably human and unmistakably a child. Clara swung down from the saddle before she had even fully registered the decision to do so, looping the reins over a clump of tall brush and pushing into the grass on her right. The prairie could be deceptive. What looked like flat, empty land was really a maze of shallow draws and hidden dips in the earth, places where a person could disappear from sight within a few steps. She waded through the grass, her skirts catching on the stalks, calling out in a voice she deliberately kept calm and low. "Hello, is someone there? Do not be afraid. My name is Clara. I'm not going to hurt you." She pushed aside a wall of grass taller than her waist and nearly stumbled into a small gully she had not seen coming. And there, huddled at the bottom of it with his knees pulled tight to his chest and his face buried in his arms, was a little boy. He could not have been more than 5 years old. He wore a cotton shirt that had once been white and a pair of trousers that were too big for him, held up by a single suspender. His boots were good quality, brown leather, but they were dusty and scuffed as though he had been walking for a long time. His dark hair was matted with dried sweat, and there were tear tracks cutting clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. He was shaking, though whether from fear or cold or simple exhaustion, Clara could not yet tell. She crouched down at the edge of the gully, keeping her voice gentle, and said, "Hey there, sweetheart. There is nothing to be scared of now. Found you." The boy lifted his face slowly, the way a wild creature does when it is trying to decide whether to run or stay. His eyes were dark brown and enormous, rimmed red from crying, and when he looked at her there was such a profound relief in his expression that Clara felt something inside her chest physically shift, like a door swinging open on a hinge it had forgotten it had. "My horse ran away," the boy said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Fell off and she ran away and I tried to follow her, but then did not know which way was home. How long have you been out here?" Clara asked. He thought about it with the particular seriousness of a small child attempting to measure time. "A very long time," he finally decided. "All right," Clara said. She slid down into the gully without a second thought and lifted the boy up, and he let himself be lifted without resistance, wrapping both arms around her neck with the complete trust that only small children and very exhausted people are capable of giving. He was heavier than he looked, solid and warm, and he smelled like sun and earth and dried grass. She settled him on her hip and climbed back out of the gully and carried him to her mare. He had stopped shaking by the time she reached the horse, and he was looking around at the prairie with a kind of dazed, recovering attention. "What is your name?" Clara asked as she settled him into the saddle and swung up behind him. "Illy," he said. "Illy, that is a fine name. Do you know where you live, Illy? What direction your home is?" He pointed vaguely west, which was the same direction she was heading, and that seemed to be the extent of his knowledge of geography. Clara nodded, tightened her arm around him, and urged the mare forward. The ride back to her homestead took the better part of an hour. Clara's place sat at the edge of a wide, shallow creek, a modest but solid house of sod and timber that she had slowly been improving since her husband Thomas had died of pneumonia the winter before last. Thomas had left her the land, the mare, a small herd of cattle, and debts that she was still working through. She had been managing alone for going on 18 months, and she had gotten rather good at it, though she would never have claimed to be anything but tired. She had no children of her own, a fact that she had long since made a kind of private peace with, though it was a peace that had cracks in it on certain evenings, when the house was too quiet and the lamp threw shadows that looked like nothing. She got the boy inside, sat him at the kitchen table, and fed him cold biscuits with butter and a glass of fresh water while she stirred up the fire. He ate with the focused intensity of a child who had not eaten in hours, and she watched him and felt something she was not quite ready to name pulling softly at her heart. "Illy," she said, sitting across from him with a cup of coffee she had poured herself, "do you know the name of your ranch? Your father's name?" He chewed thoughtfully. "Daddy," he said, which was not particularly helpful. "Of course," Clara said, and she smiled in spite of herself. "Does your daddy have a name that other grown-ups call him?" Illy scrunched his nose, considering this as though it were a genuinely puzzling philosophical question. "Mr. Holt," he finally offered. "People call him Mr. Holt." "And is there a Mrs. Holt?" Clara asked carefully, because she needed to know who she was returning this child to. Illy's face changed. Something moved through it, quick and complex like weather across an open sky. "Mama died," he said simply. The way he said it was not dramatic, but it was weighted with the kind of acceptance that children carry when a grief has become part of the landscape of their ordinary life. "I'm very sorry," Clara said, and she meant it deeply. Illy ate another biscuit. "Daddy gets sad sometimes," he confided, as though this were a secret he had decided she was trustworthy enough to hear. "But mostly he is all right," Clara nodded. "I'm sure your daddy is very worried about you right now," she said. "I'm going to try to find him, but it is getting dark and I do not know which ranch is yours, so tonight you will stay here where it is safe. Does that sound all right?" Illy considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Can I sleep near the fire?" he asked. "Absolutely," Clara said. She made him a pallet on the floor near the hearth, pulled off his boots and shook out what appeared to be half the prairie from inside them, and found a spare blanket that smelled like lavender from the dried bundles she kept in the cedar chest. She washed the worst of the grime from his face and hands with a warm cloth, while he submitted to this process with the long-suffering patience of a child who has learned that protesting makes it take longer. He was asleep before she even finished tucking the blanket around him, his breath evening out in the particular deep rhythm of total exhaustion. She stood over him for a moment in the firelight, looking at his small face slack and peaceful, and felt that door in her chest swing open again, and this time she let it. The next morning, Clara was up before dawn to see to her cattle, and when she came back inside just after sunrise, she found Illy sitting at the table, fully awake and alert, having apparently helped himself to the remaining biscuits from the night before and pulled the sugar tin close enough to investigate. She caught him with 2 fingers dipped into the sugar and could not bring herself to scold him. "Good morning," she said, hanging up her hat. "Good morning," he said, extracting his fingers with a guilty speed that fooled no one. "Your cow is very loud." "She is. Her name is Bess and she has opinions about mornings." "I have a horse," Illy said, and his expression clouded briefly. "But she ran away." "We are going to find your daddy today," Clara said. "He will help you find your horse." She made a proper breakfast of eggs and salt pork and more biscuits, and Illy ate steadily and asked about the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and whether the crack in the wall was from a gun or just the wood, and why the rooster outside sounded so angry. She answered every question with the careful attention she gave to all things, and the morning moved through the kitchen with a warmth she had not felt in a long time. After breakfast, she left him building a small fortress out of empty spools of thread and buttons from her sewing box, and rode to town to ask Sheriff Aldred if anyone had reported a missing child. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a thick white mustache and the easy manners of someone who had been doing this job long enough to stop being surprised by it, told her that yes, a man named Cole Holt had come in near dark the night before, half wild with worry, asking if anyone had found a small boy. "He is out searching the north pastures this morning," Aldred said. "His place is the Broken Spur spread, about a mile due west of yours, just past the creek bend." "You probably passed his fence line without knowing whose it was." Clara stared at him. "He is my neighbor. Has been for about 4 months," Aldred said. "Bought the Dunbar claim in April. Good man. Quiet. Got that little boy with him, just the two of them." He paused. "You found the child." "He was in a gully on the south pasture," Clara said. "His horse threw him, apparently. He is fine. He is in my kitchen building architecture out of my button box." Aldred laughed, a genuine rolling sound. "Go on home and I will send word to Holt to ride south." Clara rode back with the first pinch of something other than pure practical concern working its way into her thinking. She had a neighbor. A neighbor with a child. A neighbor who had been there 4 months and whom she had managed to entirely fail to meet. The Dunbar claim. She remembered old Dunbar well enough. A solitary, taciturn man who had died the previous year, leaving the property to a nephew who had sold it almost immediately. She had assumed the new owner was another bachelor farmer, the sort of man who would nod once across a fence line and consider social obligations discharged. She had not thought to go and introduce herself, because she had been busy surviving and because, if she were honest with herself, she had not been much in the mood for new acquaintances. She arrived home to find Illy had graduated from button architecture to an ambitious project involving her rolling pin, a large bowl, and what appeared to be an attempt to make bread. "I was helping," he said. Clara surveyed the flour distribution across the table, the floor, and what appeared to be a considerable portion of Illy himself, and said, "I can see that." She was washing the flour off the table when she heard the horse. It was a sound she recognized from her years on the prairie, the particular cadence of a horse being ridden hard and then pulled up short as the rider caught sight of a destination. She heard it come across the yard, heard the creak of saddle leather and then boot steps on the porch, and then a knock on her door so urgent it was barely a knock at all. She opened it. The man on the porch was tall, with the kind of lean, work-hardened build that comes from a life lived outside and in motion. He had dark hair that needed cutting, pushed back under a battered, wide-brimmed hat, and a jaw dark with several days of stubble. His eyes were the color of good coffee, and they were fixed on her with an expression that was one breath away from desperate, though she could see him holding that desperation tightly, keeping it from spilling over the way a man learns to do when he has been taught that the world does not much reward falling apart. "Ma'am," he said. "Am Cole Holt. I believe you may have found my son." And from behind Clara's skirts came a small, flour-dusted person who launched himself at the tall man like a cannonball and said, "Daddy," with a volume entirely out of proportion to his size. Cole Holt caught his son and held him in both arms and pressed his face against the top of the boy's head, and for a long moment he simply stood there on her porch, holding on, and Clara stood in her doorway watching and felt that cracked piece inside her chest do something entirely unexpected and warm. When Cole lifted his face, his eyes were bright. He blinked that brightness away with the efficiency of a man who has learned to manage himself and said, in a voice that was only slightly rough around the edges, "He is all right." "He is perfectly fine," Clara said. "He was frightened and hungry and exhausted, but he slept well and ate well, and I believe he has a talent for baking." Cole looked down at the flour on Illy's shirt, and then at the flour still on Clara's table visible through the open door, and something shifted in his expression. The desperation receded and something quieter and genuinely warm moved in behind it. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her. "You do not owe me anything," Clara said. "Come in. Have coffee." He hesitated for exactly 1 second, the hesitation of a man who has been self-sufficient long enough that accepting anything feels like a concession. Then he came in, still holding Illy, and sat in the chair she indicated, and she poured him coffee and set it in front of him, and he drank half of it without putting it down. "Have been riding since first light," he said. "I rode half the county last night before dark stopped me. The sheriff told me you came in to report him missing. That is how I found you. You went to town this morning. As soon as I knew his name and yours, wanted to get him back to you quickly." Cole looked at her over the rim of his cup. The look was direct and appraising in the way of a man who is good at reading situations, and whatever he read in her face seemed to settle something. "You are Clara Whitfield," he said. "Aldred mentioned you. He said you were the one running the Whitfield homestead since your husband passed." "That is correct," Clara said. "I should have come to introduce myself when I moved in," Cole said. "Kept meaning to. Things got away from me." "Ranching has a way of doing that," Clara said. Illy, who had been listening to this exchange with the attentive seriousness of a child, who understands that adult conversation often contains interesting information if you pay close enough attention, said, "Her cow has opinions about mornings." Cole looked at his son, then at Clara, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was not quite a smile, but was clearly trying to become one. "Does she?" he said. "Her name is Bess," Illy confirmed. Clara found herself smiling, and it felt like a muscle she had not used enough. "He has an excellent memory," she said. Cole stayed for another half hour, and in that time he told her the rough outline of things without being asked to. That he had come from Texas, that he had bought the Broken Spur claim after 2 years of drifting since his wife Sarah had died, that he was trying to give Lee a stable home, that the spread was coming along but there was a great deal still to be done. He said all of this in a matter-of-fact way, as though he were describing the weather, but Clara had learned from years of listening to people that the flattest voices often carried the most. There was something underneath his practicality that recognized itself in her practicality, a kind of mutual solitude that did not quite know yet what to do with another person. When he stood to leave, Illy clung briefly to Clara's skirts and then released her and looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes and said, "Can I come back and visit Bess?" "Any time you like," Clara said, and meant it. Cole settled his hat back on his head and looked at her from the doorway with an expression she could not quite read but could feel the weight of. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Truly, Mrs. Whitfield," she corrected but gently. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "I'm sorry. Will not forget again." He took Ellie's hand and they walked to his horse, and Clara stood in her doorway and watched them go, and the house felt very quiet after they left, a particular kind of quiet that is different from ordinary silence. 3 days passed before she saw him again. It was not for lack of thinking about it. Clara was a practical woman, and she was not given to mooning, but there was something about the encounter that had lodged in her mind with a persistence she found both inconvenient and somewhat interesting. She thought about the way he had held Illy on the porch. She thought about the roughness in his voice when he had asked if the boy was all right. She thought about the coffee cup, the way he had held it in both hands like something precious. She was mending a fence on the eastern edge of her property when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Cole Holt riding toward her with Illy perched in front of him on the saddle. Illy was waving before they were even within hailing distance. "We found my horse," he announced when they were close enough for conversation. "Her name is Clover and she was eating somebody's garden." "Whose garden?" Clara asked, setting down her fence pliers. "The Morrisons," Cole said. He swung down from the saddle and lifted Illy down after him. "They were not particularly pleased." "I expect not." "I brought you something," Cole said, and he reached into his saddlebag and produced a cloth-wrapped parcel which, when Clara opened it, turned out to contain half a side of smoked venison. "It is not enough," he said, "but it is what I have at the moment." "You did not need to," Clara said. "I wanted to," he said. "And I also wanted to ask if you needed any fence work done. Can see from here that this section needs at least 3 new posts." Clara looked at the fence and then at him. "Can manage my fence." "I have no doubt," he said. "But I have the posts cut already and not enough fence of my own that needs them right now, and it seems a waste." It was a graceful way to offer help, framed as practicality rather than charity, and she recognized the care in it. She considered him for a moment, standing there in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands and his expression entirely neutral, doing his level best not to look like a man who wanted something, and she decided to let him help. "All right," she said. They worked the fence together for the rest of the afternoon. Cole drove posts and she stretched wire, and Ellie ran back and forth between them carrying tools and providing a continuous commentary on everything he observed, including several opinions about the quality of the dirt, the behavior of a prairie dog he spotted in the distance, and a complete retelling of a story about a man he had seen in town who had a very large mustache. Cole worked with the focused efficiency of a man who knew what he was doing and did not need to talk while he did it. But between tasks they talked, carefully at first, in the way of two people who are both self-sufficient and have therefore gotten slightly out of practice with the art of easy conversation, about the land, about cattle prices, about the difficulty of the summer drought, about the nearest water source and whether the creek was likely to hold. But underneath the practical conversation, there was something else happening, something quieter and more significant, a gradual recognition, like two people walking toward each other from a long way off and beginning to understand that they are heading for the same place. She told him about Thomas a little, about the 18 months alone, about the debts and the cattle and the learning curve of running everything herself. She told it plainly, without self-pity, and he listened with the full attention of a man who does not give his attention lightly. He told her about Sarah, about Texas, about the 2 years of drifting with Illy, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, before he had decided that Illy needed a real home with real walls and a real school within riding distance, and had bought the broken spur claim with everything he had saved. He does not really remember her, Cole said of Sarah, and his voice was level, but there was something in it. He was only 3 when she died. I worry about that sometimes. He knows she is loved, Clara said, because you love her memory. Children can feel that. Cole looked at her. It was the direct, appraising look she was coming to recognize, the look of a man taking careful measure. You have a kind way of thinking, he said. Or possibly a practical one, she said. The fence was finished by evening, and the sunset was the kind that Kansas does better than anywhere in the world. A full half the sky gone pink and gold and deep arterial red, the clouds lit from underneath like lanterns. They stood for a moment looking at it without talking, and Ellie stood between them and took one hand of each without asking permission and swung their arms a little, and neither of them said anything about it. Cole came again 4 days later with a question about whether she knew a good farrier in town, and stayed 2 hours. He came the week after that to return a hammer he had borrowed, though she was fairly certain she had told him to keep it, and stayed 3 hours. He began sending Ellie over on the gray pony they had apparently acquired for him, a small calm animal with one white foot, and Ellie would arrive at her door at unpredictable intervals with small presents. A perfect arrowhead he had found in the creek bed, a bunch of prairie wildflowers that were mostly wilted by the time they arrived, a note written in a child's struggling hand that said, quite simply, "You are nice." Clara put the note in the cedar chest with her most important things. The town of Millhaven had a church social every 3rd Saturday of the month, and in late August, Clara found herself at this gathering in her good dress with her hair properly done, and was about 15 minutes into a conversation with the minister's wife about the price of calico when she saw Cole Holt across the churchyard, looking deeply uncomfortable in a slightly better shirt than his usual work one, trying to prevent Ellie from climbing the fence that bordered the church cemetery. Their eyes met across the yard, and she felt it like a physical thing, a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward, unreasonably and undeniably. He made his way to her, Ellie in tow, and the minister's wife tactfully found something else to attend to with a knowing look that Clara chose not to acknowledge. "You clean up considerably," Cole said. "As do you," Clara said. He laughed properly, for the first time she had heard him do it, a real full sound, and it was a very good laugh. They stayed together for the rest of the social, which was not a small thing in a town of Millhaven's size, where everyone was watching everything and drawing conclusions with the cheerful efficiency of people with limited entertainment options. Clara was aware of the watching and did not particularly care. Cole appeared to be aware of it and to have arrived at the same position. On the way home, riding side by side in the early evening with Ellie asleep in front of Cole on his horse, Cole said, "I would like to take you to supper when I can get Mrs. Garvey to sit with Ellie, if that is something you would consider." Clara considered it, which took approximately 2 seconds. "I would consider it," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. He said it the way he said most things, in a way that sounded plain but contained more than the word itself. Mrs. Garvey was the widow 2 miles north who had taken a shine to Ellie from the moment they moved in, and she agreed to sit with him the following Friday. Cole arrived at Clara's door at 6 o'clock with his hair combed, and his best hat, and a look of concentrated determination that Clara found both amusing and endearing. They rode to Millhaven and ate at the hotel dining room, which was the only proper restaurant in a 50-mile radius, and served a beef stew that was legitimately good and a peach pie that was extraordinary. The dining room had a checked tablecloth and a lamp on every table, and the whole thing had the slightly formal atmosphere of a place that was trying very hard to be civilized, which Clara appreciated. They talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say. This surprised both of them, she thought, though neither said so. They talked about Texas and Kansas and the difference between them, which was considerable. About the cattle market and the railroad and the way both things were changing the plains faster than anyone was quite comfortable with. About books, and it turned out Cole had a crate of them in his house that he had carried from job to job for 2 years, and that he loaned her 3 that she had not read, and she gave him 2 in return. She told him about growing up in Ohio and coming west as a young married woman, and the terror and wonder of the first sight of the open plains, how it had felt like standing at the edge of something infinite. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about horses and cattle drives, and the particular freedom of a life that was mostly sky. And in the spaces between the words, there was something building that both of them could feel, and neither of them mentioned directly, because they were both the kind of person who does not say a thing until they are certain of it. When he brought her home and they stood on her porch in the warm August dark with the crickets filling the silence and the stars doing what Kansas stars do, which is everything, Cole turned his hat in his hands and said, "Have not felt easy with another person in a long time." "Nor I," Clara said. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that am not in a hurry. Understand that things take time. Am not going anywhere." Clara looked at him in the dark and thought about Thomas, who she had loved with the straightforward, devoted love of a young woman, and thought about what it was to be a person who had survived losing something essential and had continued anyway, and she thought about a small boy in a gully on the prairie who had opened a door inside her that had been closed for a long time. "I know you are not going anywhere," she said, "and am grateful for that." He nodded. He touched the brim of his hat, the particular gesture of a man who has been raised with manners and reaches for them when other language fails him, and he rode away through the dark, and Clara stood on her porch until she could not hear his horse anymore. September came in with a cooler edge, and the cottonwoods along the creek began their slow turn to gold. Ellie was now a more or less daily fixture at Clara's place, either riding over on his small gray pony or, on several occasions, simply appearing on foot in the manner of a child who does not always consult with adults about his plans. Cole always came to collect him in the evenings and usually stayed for supper, because Clara had started cooking for 2.5 without quite deciding to, and because Cole had started chopping her wood and repairing her barn roof and other things that had gotten behind in the way things always did on a one-person homestead, and it seemed rude to chase him off before he had eaten. The three of them fell into a kind of rhythm that felt both entirely natural and slightly astonishing in its naturalness, like a song that seems familiar the very first time you hear it. They were not yet a family. They both knew this, and neither of them pushed it. But they were something, and the something was growing with the particular quiet inevitability of things that are meant. One evening, helping Illy with the buttons on his coat while Cole saddled up for the ride home, Clara heard Cole out in the yard talking to his horse in a low murmur, and she thought, without intending to think it, that she did not want him to leave. That she wanted him to stay in the warm kitchen and drink one more cup of coffee and continue the conversation they had started at supper about whether a person could be fundamentally changed by a place or whether they just showed, in a new place, what they had always been. She finished Illy's buttons and kissed the top of his head, and he said, "I love you, Miss Clara," with the complete uncomplicated directness of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of saying true things. It hit her like a wave, warm and total. She held herself very still for a moment and then said, "I love you too, Illy." And the words were easy and true, and she meant every syllable. Cole had stopped talking to his horse. She looked up and found him standing in the open doorway with his hand on the doorframe, and his expression doing something complicated that she did not have a name for yet. Illy went to his father and took his hand and pulled him toward the horse and said, "Come on, Daddy, it is getting cold." And Cole let himself be pulled, but he looked back at Clara once from the door, and what she saw in that look was something she would think about for days. The first frost came in October, and with it came a trouble that had been building on the horizon of the region all summer. The cattle barons to the north, men with names Clara knew mostly from newspaper columns, had been making noise about water rights along the creek that fed both the Whitfield homestead and the Broken Spur. The creek, a tributary of the Smoky Hill River, passed through both their properties and had always been considered common water, managed by informal agreement among the small ranchers along its banks. But a man named Gideon Farrow, who had recently bought up several claims to the north and now controlled the most significant upstream portion, had begun diverting water to his pastures in quantities that the downstream ranchers were noticing in their stock tanks and watering holes. Clara had seen it first when her cattle were coming up thirsty on the south pasture, and she had ridden the creek line and found where the water had been redirected. She had gone to see Sheriff Aldred, who told her what she already suspected, that water rights in Kansas were complicated, that Farrow had lawyers and influence, and that the law was not always as clear as it ought to be. Cole found out about it the same week when he noticed his East Pasture Creek dropping, and he rode to her place to compare notes with the expression of a man who is keeping himself from being angry with considerable effort. "He cannot do this," Cole said, sitting at her table with the map she had spread out between them, his finger tracing the creek line. "This is not his water to take. He is claiming a prior appropriation right," Clara said. "He says he was irrigating from this creek before any of us had our claims. That is not true, and he knows it. Of course it is not true, but true and provable are different things." Cole looked at her. "You have thought about this." "I've had 18 months of dealing with this land alone," Clara said. "I have thought about a great many things." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the maps, and then he said, "We need to talk to the other ranchers on the creek. Mortimer, the Hallorans, the Beckett family. If we all go together, we have a stronger case." "Already spoke to Jacob Halloran yesterday," Clara said. "He is in." Mortimer is old and tired and scared of Farrow, but his son Matthew is angrier and more likely to act. Cole looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to admiration. "You have been organizing this already," he said. "Someone had to start," she said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You are remarkable, do you know that?" The word landed between them and sat there, warm and direct, and Clara felt color move into her face with a certainty that she found somewhat irritating and mostly lovely. "And practical," she said. "Those are the same thing in my experience," he said. They organized a meeting of the Creek ranchers at the Halloran place, a gathering of 8 families in total, and drafted a formal petition to the county court outlining Farrow's illegal diversion. Cole wrote the petition, which surprised Clara until she remembered he had mentioned studying law briefly in his younger years before a lack of money had ended that particular ambition. He wrote it clearly and precisely and with a force that was entirely convincing, and when he read it aloud at the meeting, there was a silence afterward that felt like agreement. "You missed your calling," Clara told him on the ride home. "Maybe," he said. "But I have gotten rather attached to the calling I have now." He said it in a way that could have meant the land, or Illy, or all of it together, or something more specific, and he did not look at her when he said it, which told her something she was glad to know. Farrow did not take the petition quietly. He came to town and had words with the sheriff and made a visit to the county judge, and for 2 uncomfortable weeks, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Clara lay awake 2 nights running listening to the wind and thinking about the creek and the cattle, and the fact that without that water in a dry autumn, she could lose half her herd before spring. On the 3rd morning, Cole rode up at sunrise and knocked on her door, and when she opened it, he said, "The judge ruled for us." Clara stood in the doorway in her wrapper, her hair not yet pinned, and the relief was so immediate and so physical that she put a hand on the doorframe to steady herself. "All of us?" she asked. "All the Creek ranchers? Full restoration of the prior arrangement and a formal injunction against further diversion?" "Farrow's lawyers are furious." He paused. "Are you all right?" "Am very all right," she said. "Am so relieved, am slightly dizzy." "Sit down," he said with immediate concern. "I do not need to sit down, I am fine." But she sat down anyway, because the kitchen chair was right there, and her knees were genuinely weak with relief. Cole came inside and put a hand on her shoulder, a simple touch, a steadying touch, and then he went to the stove and made coffee because apparently he had learned where everything was kept well enough to do that, and he sat across from her and pushed the cup toward her, and she looked at him in the morning light, this man in her kitchen, this careful, good, steady man, and thought clearly and without qualification that she was falling in love with him. The thought did not alarm her. It felt, in fact, like something that had been happening for long enough already that acknowledging it was merely catching up to what was already true. October turned to November, and the prairie took on the spare, windswept beauty of the late season. The cottonwoods were stripped bare and the grass had gone to pale gold, and the skies were the high clear blue of late autumn, the kind of blue that seems to recede forever upward. Clara had put up enough provisions for the winter, her cattle count was healthy, and the creek was flowing properly again. She felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was ahead of things rather than behind them. Cole fixed her barn roof before the snows, and she made him dinner, and this time when dinner was finished, Annalie had fallen asleep at the table and needed to be lifted and carried. Cole stayed to help clean up without being asked, and they washed dishes together in the lamplight like 2 people who have established a practice partnership, and the domesticity of it was so comfortable and so good that neither of them felt the need to remark on it. When everything was done and the kitchen was clean and Ali was wrapped in his coat and carried out to the horse, Cole came back one last time. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and he said, "Clara." He had started using her name sometime in October, the exact date she could not pinpoint, but she had noticed it the first time and remembered the warmth of it. "Cole," she said. He took a breath. "Am not good at this," he said. "I'm better at fence posts and water rights as it turns out, but I want to say that I have been happier these past months than I have been in a long time, and I think you know why, and I would very much like to court you properly if you are willing to be courted." It was the longest speech she had heard him give outside of the Creek meeting, and it clearly cost him something, and she loved him for the cost of it. "Am willing," she said, "to be courted." He smiled then, a full, real smile, and it changed his whole face, opened something in it, and Clara thought that she would like to make him smile like that as often as possible for as long as she lived, and that was a remarkably clarifying thought. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Cole," she said. He rode away into the cold November dark, and she shut the door and stood in her kitchen with both hands pressed to her sternum like she was holding something precious inside it. Winter on the Kansas plains was not a gentle thing. The first snow came in late November, a serious snow, and the temperature dropped in the way it does on the high plains, fast and final, and the world went white and quiet and still. Clara had done this alone before and knew the rhythms of it, the morning chores in the cold, the constant fire, the long evenings with a book and the lamp, the way the isolation pressed in and had to be managed. This winter was different. Cole came every third or fourth day, riding through the snow with Ellie bundled up in front of him so that only his eyes and nose were visible above his scarf, and they would spend the day together, the three of them, tending what needed tending, and then retreating to the warmth of the kitchen. Cole had a talent for fixing things, and her house had more things that needed fixing than she had fully inventoried, and he moved through the repairs methodically and with evident satisfaction. And Clara let him because she had gotten past pretending she did not want his company. In December, 2 days before Christmas, a blizzard came down from the north that pinned Cole and Ellie at her place for 3 days. Clara had warned them when the sky went the particular flat gray that meant serious weather, but by the time Cole had been persuaded that yes, they really should stay, the storm had already closed in. They spent those 3 days in a closeness that was not forced but utterly natural, the three of them, in the small warm space of her kitchen and parlor. Cole read to Ellie from one of Clara's books in the evenings while she knitted, and Ellie fell asleep to the sound of his father's voice and Clara's needles clicking in the lamp warmth, and it was the most peaceful 3 days she could remember. On the second night, after Ellie was asleep on his pallet and the storm was hammering the windows and the lamp was burning low, Cole and Clara sat across from each other at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours in the particular candor that comes with warmth and firelight, and the knowledge that the world outside is too wild to be navigated, that you are held where you are and might as well be present in it. He told her things he had not told her before, about the night Sarah died, of a fever that came on fast and took her in 4 days before any real help could reach them, about the way Ellie had sat in the corner of that room and been very quiet and had not understood, not then, not really. About the 2 years of drifting after, of working himself to exhaustion on other men's land because exhaustion was the only way he knew to outrun grief. She told him about Thomas, about the long, slow decline of the pneumonia and the particular torment of watching a strong person become fragile, about the silence after, about the days when getting out of bed had been a project that required a full argument with herself, about how the land had saved her in the end because it did not care how sad she was and kept presenting her with tasks that had to be done. "The land does not grieve with you," Cole said. "No," Clara said. "But it stays. It is there in the morning. That means something." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and said, "You are the most honest person I have ever known." "Have gotten too old for pretending," she said. "You are 27. Some years are longer than others," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was deliberate and gentle and entirely unhurried, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that in the blizzard's noise while the fire burned and the storm did its work outside, and it was the simplest and most significant thing. "Clara," he said, and his voice was low and careful. "I know," she said, because she did. The blizzard ended on the 3rd morning and the world emerged white and fresh and impossibly bright, the snow unmarked in every direction and the sky a hard, clean blue. Cole dug out her path to the barn and the door of the outhouse and the gate, and then he stood in her yard with the shovel and looked at her where she stood on the porch with her coffee, and something passed between them in that look that did not require words. He and Ellie rode home through the fresh snow, Ellie chattering about the blizzard with the enthusiastic retrospective enjoyment of a child for whom danger, in the past tense, is simply an adventure, and Clara watched them go and held her coffee cup and was, quietly and completely happy. Christmas was 2 days later, and it was spent together at her place, because Cole had asked and she had said yes, and she had made a ham and apple preserves and 2 kinds of pie, and Ellie had managed to keep a secret for 6 days, which was genuinely impressive, and presented Clara with a small carved wooden horse that Cole had made and that Ellie had painted, somewhat enthusiastically, with a reddish color that was more or less the shade of a horse if you allowed for artistic interpretation. Clara put it on the mantelpiece immediately, and Ellie looked at it critically and said, "I think I used too much paint." "It is perfect," Clara said, and she meant it entirely. Cole gave her a copy of a book she had mentioned wanting, one she had only briefly spoken of months ago, and the fact that he had remembered and found it told her everything she needed to know about the quality of his attention. She gave him a new pair of gloves that she had knitted herself in the evenings, and he turned them in his hands with an expression she had come to recognize, the expression of a man who is moved and doing his best to manage it. "They will last longer than the last pair," she said. "They will," he agreed. "Thank you." He looked up at her over the gloves with coffee-dark eyes in the candlelight, and she thought, with the clarity and certainty of a person who knows their own mind, that she loved him. The winter turned and turned, and by February the worst of it was past. The creek ran again, a cold thin thread through the ice-edged banks, and the cattle were all right and the hay stores had held, and Clara felt the particular satisfaction of a farmer who has survived their season. On a mild afternoon in late February, when the sky was pale blue, and the first tentative hints of spring were audible in the behavior of the birds, Cole arrived at her place without Ellie, which was unusual enough to note. He tied his horse and came up to the porch, and she came out to meet him, and she could see from 50 feet away that he had something on his mind, the way she had come to know his face well enough to read its weather. She stood on the porch steps, and he stood in the yard, and the wind moved between them, gentle and cold and smelling of snow melt. "I need to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said. He did not reach for his hat. He held it at his side, looking at her with the full directness that she had come to know was his most honest mode. "I love you," he said. "Have been meaning to say it plainly for long enough that it has become unreasonable not to. I love you, Clara, and I would very much like to ask you to marry me if you would do me the honor of considering it." The wind blew. The creek ran somewhere below the bank. A red-winged blackbird, the first she had heard that year, called once from the cottonwoods. "Cole Holt," she said, "I love you too, and yes, I will marry you." He crossed the yard to her in 3 steps and took her face in both hands, and she put her hands on his chest, and he kissed her there in the cold February afternoon with the whole of the prairie spread out behind him, and the sky going pink at the edges, and it was exactly as it should have been, warm and real and worth every complicated month that had led to it. When they stopped, she was laughing a little, and so was he, and he rested his forehead against hers and said, "I was not entirely certain you would say yes." "You were reasonably certain," she said. "I was hoping," he said. "There is a difference. Then I am glad your hope was justified." He kissed her again, which she considered the appropriate response. They told Ellie that evening, and his reaction was so instantaneously and wholly joyful that it settled any remaining anxiety about the rightness of the decision. He cheered and jumped and then said, very seriously, "Does this mean Miss Clara will live with us?" "It means we will all live together," Clara said. Ellie considered the geography of this. "At our house or your house?" Cole and Clara looked at each other over the top of his head. "We have not decided that yet," Cole said. "Your house has a better barn," Ellie said, referring to Cole's place, "but Miss Clara's house has a better kitchen." "That is an excellent analysis," Clara said. "We will work it out," Cole said, and he put one arm around Clara's shoulders and she leaned into it, and he took Clara's hand and squeezed it, and the three of them stood there in the kitchen in the lamplight, and were for that moment exactly what they were going to be. They were married in April, when the prairie was doing the brief extravagant thing it does in spring, when the wildflowers come up through the grasses in blues and yellows, and the meadowlarks are everywhere, and the whole world smells like green growing things. The ceremony was at the Millhaven Church, performed by Reverend Dawes, in front of a crowd that included the Hallorans and the Becketts and Mrs. Garvey and Sheriff Aldred, and what appeared to be a substantial portion of the county, because word had gotten around and nobody had wanted to miss it. He stood between them through the ceremony in a new shirt and a very grave expression, and held both their hands at intervals as if to make sure neither of them was going anywhere. Reverend Dawes performed the ceremony with the warmth of a man who is genuinely pleased by the occasion, and when he said, "You may kiss your bride," Cole turned to Clara with the particular quiet smile that was her favorite of all his expressions, and she thought, looking at him in the spring morning light, that she was the luckiest woman on the high plains. They settled the question of which house by doing the sensible thing, which was to combine the best of both. They kept the Broken Spur as their primary residence because it was slightly larger and had the better water arrangement, but Cole improved the kitchen to Clara's specifications over the summer, and she moved her cedar chest and her herb bundles and her rooster and her very opinionated cow to the Broken Spur, and it became, swiftly and completely, home. The Whitfield homestead they kept as a second property, leasing the pasture to Jacob Halloran's son for a fair monthly arrangement that helped cover the remaining debts Thomas had left, and within 2 years those debts were cleared and the land was unencumbered, and Clara stood at the window of the Broken Spur kitchen one morning with coffee, and the knowledge that she was free and clear and profoundly all right. Cole came up behind her and put his arms around her and his chin on her shoulder and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Debts," she said. "Not very romantic," he said. "I was thinking that they are gone," she said, "all of them." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is actually very romantic," and she laughed and turned around in the circle of his arms and kissed him. He had started school in Millhaven in September and was making the daily ride with growing confidence, and a social life that he reported on in comprehensive detail each evening. He had acquired a best friend named Billy Mortimer, the grandson of old Mortimer of the Creek fight, and the two of them appeared to conduct themselves on the theory that the world was a place of infinite interesting possibilities, many of which could be explored by climbing things. He was, by any measure, a happy child. He was also, by his own particular nature, a perceptive one, and he had incorporated Clara into his life with such completeness and such generosity of spirit that it sometimes took her breath away. He called her Clara, not Mama, which was right and honest, because he was old enough to understand the difference and she was not trying to replace what he had lost. But the way he came to her with scraped knees and overheard gossip and questions about arithmetic and the occasional bad dream, the way he sat next to her at the table and reached for her hand without thinking about it, that was its own kind of name. She loved him with a love that was total and ungoverned, and she was grateful for it every day. In the spring of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after she had found a small flour-dusted child in a gully on the south pasture, Clara told Cole that she was expecting. They were in the kitchen, the same kitchen where so much of the significant conversation of their life together had taken place, and she told him carefully and directly, in the manner she did all important things. He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough for her to begin monitoring it, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her with a care and completeness that told her everything she needed to know. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it being the first thing. "I'm very well," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm the happiest I've ever been," she said, and meant it without qualification. He held her for a long time, and she felt his breath slow and even out and knew he was finding his footing in this new territory, this man who loved so carefully and so completely, and she gave him all the time he needed. Ali was told at supper that evening and responded with a sequence of rapid-fire questions that demonstrated an impressive, if somewhat misinformed, grasp of how reproduction worked, and then said, very earnestly, "I will be a very good big brother. Am already good at explaining things." "You are excellent at explaining things," Cole said. "I explained to Billy Mortimer why the creek water in summer is warmer than the creek water in spring, and he said, was the smartest person he knew," Illy said. "High praise," Clara said. "He also said his dog was smarter than most people, so am not sure how much to weigh it," Illy said thoughtfully. Clara and Cole looked at each other across the table, and the look was full of laughter and love, and the particular joy of people who have found their life and know it. The pregnancy proceeded well. Clara was strong and healthy and practical about it, which was her way with all things, and she continued her work on the ranch with modifications as the months went along, and Cole hovered at the edges of this in a way that was solicitous without being smothering, which she appreciated. He built a cradle over the winter, working on it in the evenings by the fire while Clara sewed and Illy read, a careful and beautiful piece of work that he made from oak and finished smooth as water. Illy helped with the sanding and contributed several unsolicited suggestions about design features, most of which Cole managed to diplomatically redirect. The baby came in November, a boy, born just before dawn on a cold, clear morning when the stars were still thick overhead and the frost lay silver on the grass. The midwife, Mrs. Dunbar from town, was there, and Cole was in the house, in the kitchen, pacing with the focused desperation of a man who knows that this is something he cannot fix or build or solve, who can only wait. Illy was at Mrs. Garvey's, which was probably wise. When Mrs. Dunbar came to the kitchen doorway and told him he could come in, Cole went to the bedroom doorway and stopped. Clara was in the bed with a small wrapped bundle on her chest, and she looked up at him with eyes that were tired and radiant in a way that was entirely her own, and she said, "Come and meet your son." Cole came to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at the baby, who was red and small and had already formed a very firm opinion about the world, communicated through his ongoing vocal commentary. Cole put one careful finger against the baby's tiny fist, and the fist closed around it with the automatic tenacity of newborns, and Cole's face did the complicated, moving thing it did when he was trying to manage being overwhelmed. "He is all right?" Cole asked. "He is perfectly healthy," Mrs. Dunbar confirmed from the doorway. "And you?" Cole asked Clara. "I'm very well," Clara said. "I'm wonderful." He kissed her then very gently, and she felt the trembling in him, the enormousness of the moment being held in a person who held things carefully, and she put her free hand on his face and said, "We are all right, Cole, all of us." "Yes," he said, "all of us." They named the baby James Thomas Holt, James for Cole's father and Thomas in memory of Clara's first husband, which felt right and honest and generous to everyone who had made her into the person she now was. When Ali was brought home the next morning and shown his brother, he was very serious about it for a full 30 seconds, studying the baby with the critical attention of an 8-year-old assessing a new development. Then he said, "He is very small," which was accurate, and then, "I will protect him," which was entirely sincere, and Clara had to look at the ceiling for a moment. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was the kind of winter that is remembered in a county for decades, fierce and long and relentlessly cold. The cattle required constant management, the creek froze solid for 6 weeks, and there were 3 snowstorms in February alone. But they had prepared well, had hay enough and wood enough and stores enough, and they moved through the winter's demands together with the practiced efficiency of a household that has learned its own rhythms. Cole rose early and Clara rose with him, and they had their coffee in the dark kitchen before the rest of the house woke. And these early mornings became a kind of institution, a quiet hour of coffee and low conversation, and the occasional silence that needed nothing added to it. James slept in his oak cradle in the corner of the kitchen during these mornings, making the small sounds that sleeping babies make, and the fire threw its warmth across everything. And it was, Clara thought, the kind of ordinary that people mean when they say they want a good life. Illy recovered his horse Clover from the Morrison garden and grew attached to her, with the depth of attachment that is specific to a child and his first horse, and Clover had the patient good nature to deserve it. By the spring of 1881, he was riding her with the competent ease of a boy who has grown into himself on horseback, and he and Billy Mortimer spent their Saturdays on an ongoing program of exploration and discovery that Clara monitored with a combination of pride and mild anxiety. The broken spur itself had grown. Cole had added 2 rooms and improved the barn and put in a proper kitchen garden that Clara tended with the focused energy she brought to growing things, and the little ranch was, by any practical measure, doing well. The cattle were healthy and the prices were decent, and the water was uncontested and the neighbors were good. The Hallorans came for supper once a month, and the Becketts came for the church social, and Sheriff Aldred came fishing in the creek, with Cole on occasional Sunday afternoons, and Mrs. Garvey came to visit Illy and the baby and was, by now, essentially a member of the family. But more than the material things, the broken spur had become in its every particular the place where Clara Whitfield, now Clara Holt, had found the life she was meant for. The prairie outside the windows was the same prairie it had always been, vast and indifferent and brutally beautiful, but she was no longer alone in it, and that difference was everything. One evening in May, when James was 6 months old and fat with health and deeply interested in everything that moved, Clara was sitting on the porch in the last of the daylight, nursing him, and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the evening. She could hear Cole in the barn talking to the horses, his voice a low murmur that carried through the warm air. She could hear Illy somewhere around the corner of the house, engaged in what sounded like an elaborate game that involved running and occasional dramatic declarations about the fates of various fictional adversaries. She looked out at the prairie in the long golden light and thought about the evening 2 years and more ago, when she had been riding back from town with flour and coffee and a spool of blue thread, humming a hymn, thinking about nothing in particular. She thought about the sound she had heard in the grass. She thought about a small boy in a gully, with dust on his face and enormous dark eyes, and a complete and trusting willingness to be carried. She thought about how everything that was now her life had come from that moment, from the decision to stop the horse and wade into the grass toward a sound she might have ridden past, from the particular quality of attention she had been taught by grief and solitude that made her capable of hearing what was small and easy to miss. She thought about Cole on her porch with his hat in his hands and the desperate held quality of his relief. She thought about coffee and fences and water rights and blizzards and church socials, and a February afternoon with a red-winged blackbird calling the first call of spring. She thought about a carved wooden horse, painted with enthusiastic imprecision, sitting on her mantelpiece because it was perfect, and she meant it. She thought about the cradle that now held a sleeping baby who had her eyes and his father's stubborn mouth, and his brother's absolute conviction that the world was interesting and worth engaging with. James made a small contented sound and settled deeper into her arm, and Cole came out of the barn and saw her on the porch and stopped for a moment just looking at her the way he did sometimes, with his whole face open and unguarded, the way it almost never was with anyone else. He came to the porch and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. And they sat together in the May evening watching the light leave the sky in stages, rose and amber and the deepening blue of dusk, while the prairie stretched away in every direction and the evening star came out, and Ellie rounded the corner of the house at a run and came up the porch steps and said, "What are you looking at?" And Cole said, "Everything," which was the exact right answer. Ellie came and wedged himself into the space on Clara's other side and looked out at the prairie with them, the three of them and the baby, on the porch of their home in the fading light, and Clara felt the completeness of it settle into her bones like warmth. She had found him in the grass, a small lost thing, frightened and trusting. She had brought him home without knowing where home was, without knowing that the home he belonged to was right next door, and that the road to her own home ran directly through him. She thought sometimes that this was the prairie's doing, that the land had its own intentions and moved people toward what they needed with the patient indirection of something that has all the time in the world. She did not know if she believed that, not exactly, but she knew that she was grateful to the grass and the wind and the particular afternoon light that had made her listen for something small and easy to miss. She was grateful for all of it, for the hard years and the good years and the years that were both, for Thomas who had loved her first and given her the land she stood on, for the debt and the drought and the water rights and every difficult thing that had made her into someone capable of this life, for the neighbor she had failed to meet for 4 months and the son who had made meeting him inevitable, for the sound in the grass, for the boy in the gully, for the man on her porch with his hat in his hands. Cole turned and kissed the top of her head, a simple and habitual tenderness, and she closed her eyes and listened to the prairie evening, the wind in the grass and the last birds and the distant low conversation of the cattle, and James sleeping warmly against her, and Ellie on her left side beginning a detailed account of the game he had been playing and the various fictional adversaries he had apparently vanquished, and she thought that she would not change a single step of the road that had brought her here, not the grief and not the loneliness and not the long hard seasons of being alone, because all of it had been necessary and all of it had led to this. To Cole saying, "That sounds like quite a battle," to Ellie's account, to Ellie saying it was very brave, to Clara laughing softly so as not to wake the baby, to the star coming out above the prairie and the dark coming down soft and complete and the lamp in the window beginning to matter, throwing its gold light across the porch boards, to Cole standing and reaching his hand down to her and saying, "Come inside, it is getting cold," to the warmth of the kitchen and the fire and the smell of supper still on the air, and the cradle in the corner and the boy kicking off his boots, and the man checking the latch on the door, all the small, ordinary gestures of a life that had been built out of unlikely materials, out of loss and solitude, and a sound in the tall grass on a golden Kansas afternoon. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at it, all of it, her husband and her children and her home, and the word that came to her was not happiness, though she was happy, was not gratitude, though she was grateful, was not peace, though she was peaceful. The word was simply right, everything finally exactly right. "What are you standing there for?" Cole asked, looking at her from across the kitchen with the small quiet smile that was her favorite. "I was just thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him. At this man who had come to her porch with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat and his son found and his life beginning again. At the man who wrote water rights petitions by lamplight and carved oak cradles in the winter evenings and rode through blizzard snows to check on her cattle and said, "I love you," plainly when he meant it and meant it every time. "About how we found each other," she said. He crossed the kitchen to her, unhurried and certain, and took her free hand and looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, everything he felt, everything they had made together. "I think Ellie found us both," he said. She laughed and he laughed with her, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was burning and the baby was sleeping and the prairie was quiet outside under its canopy of stars. And out in the barn Clover the horse and opinionated Bess, the cow, were settled for the night, and Ellie was at the table demanding to know what was funny, and everything was resolved and whole and complete. Outside, the great Kansas night stretched away in every direction, dark and starred and full of wind. the same prairie that had asked so much of her and given her everything in return. She had learned in the years of her life on it that the land did not sentimentalize. It simply was what it was, enormous and enduring and truthful, and if you paid attention and worked hard and listened for the sounds that were easy to miss, it gave you what you needed. Sometimes it gave you more than that. Sometimes it put a small boy in a gully and a neighbor you had never met, and a sound in the grass that changed everything. She held her husband's hand in the warm kitchen of their home and was, completely and without reservation, where she was supposed to be.